I suppose if that was the first time, maybe it was for somebody here, but suppose that was the first time you had read that chapter together, Revelation 16 that we just read. I'm sure for many of us it's words we've read many times over perhaps many years. But what impression perhaps would we be left with? What would strike us? Well, there's all kinds of language in this chapter. Just to start with, and I'm not going to give a detailed exposition of all of this chapter, otherwise we would leave here very late this evening, but I'll just draw attention to verse 5. And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. There's a recognition and a desire that the Almighty and his ways and his Son is recognized as just and righteous. And there's the same acclamation there in verse 7. Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments. And so as Abraham recorded many years ago, didn't he? Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? At the very heart of the Scriptures is that appeal to us who are mere sons and daughters of Adam, who are dust, to acknowledge the righteousness of the Almighty. And this remarkable book is really telling us, isn't it, in advance, how the Almighty is going to establish his righteousness, how he is going to be shown as right in the earth. And this great arc of history, at which we stand, as we understand it, at the end of that arc, stretching all the way from the time of the Lord Jesus to our own, and then his near return, demonstrates how the Almighty has been demonstrated as righteous and just in every generation. And here's the point. Because our understanding is that we stand at the most ultimately important point in this chapter. Here is the coming of the Lord, isn't it? Right towards the end of the chapter, as we had it there. Verse 15, Behold, I come as a thief. And in our second talk, God willing, I want to bring the exhortation a little closer to home and think about that for each of us. But to start with, to understand how that principle of the Almighty gathering the nations together, how we see that. You see, we just saw it, didn't we, in those opening verses that we read, of how the unclean spirits like frogs are going to be gathering together the nations. And how our world, in fact, reflects those things that have happened in the past. We often talk about the fact that the modern day approach to the way that we run civilization, the way the world thinks, the spirit of democracy that came out of the French Revolution, I'm not talking about that in detail today, but all of those things shape our world and the way that most ordinary people just think about things. Those spirits, those ways of thinking were to go into the whole world. The same word used for the inhabited earth. And the consequence is that they are going to bring together, to gather the nations. In actual fact, of course, we can read in verse 16 that it is God who is gathering them together into a place called Armageddon in the Hebrew tongue. And we'll consider that in a moment. And you see, the point is confirmed because in chapter 19 we read of a gathering together and an opposition. On the one hand, those who are gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse, even the Lord Jesus Christ. So this world that we live in, which is the product of all of these centuries that have gone by, and that the Lord has revealed for us in this book, our world is the product, the end product of that, so to speak, even as much as I believe we are at the end of Gentile times. And they are gathered to make war. You just notice the emphasis, the connecting emphasis in those verses. The battle to make war. And as we shall see, the idea of Armageddon is that point, that ultimate point, where on the one hand humanity and its own desires and its own perspectives is pitted against the Almighty and his will and his declared decree. So the nations are being gathered together. And to understand this perspective, I want to go back to the Old Testament and some well-known passages for us. Joel chapter 3, and just think of them and help to use them to put that Revelation reading we just saw in context. So let's start in in Joel chapter 3. Now the context is given very helpfully for us at the beginning of Joel chapter 3, for we read that, "Behold, in those days and at that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem." So Israel have to be in their land. Judah and Jerusalem have to be inhabited so that this prophecy can be fulfilled. And just interesting, isn't it, that in Revelation, it was in chapter 16 we read that it's the place called in the Hebrew tongue, which of course was a dead language, wasn't it, until Eliezer ben Yehuda picked it up and decreed from his perspective that it was necessary for the Jews to have that identity, and started off the process with his own son, who he said, for this to happen, for this dead language to come back to life, there has to be one child who will only ever speak Hebrew. His own son, he taught him and made sure that that was the language, and from him came this remarkable resurrection of a nation in God's hand, speaking that language. And then says verse 2, "I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat." I will gather all nations. So at the time when Israel are in their land, at the time when it could be said in the Hebrew tongue, then all nations are being gathered, just as we read in verse 14, the kings of the earth and of the whole world. Revelation 16 verse 14 told us. And why? Well, because God says he is going to plead with them there. And to plead is this word that relates to judgment. It is to enter into a controversy. In fact, it is a word really which has a technical sense, doesn't it? It is a word that means a legal pleading, if you like. There's a controversy here. It's a case that is going to be argued. And it's of significance then, isn't it, that when we read of the valley of Jehoshaphat, that it is the valley of Yahweh's judgment. Now, this clear determination of the Almighty, then, is spelt out for us. His determination is to gather the nations, that they might be gathered together. Interestingly enough, you perhaps know that in Zephaniah chapter 3, where we have that idea that he's going to gather and assemble all nations, it's that verse, interestingly, that has all the letters, as we understand it, of the Hebrew alphabet there, just to underline the point. The Jews in their land with that language resurrected. But what is this judgment about? What is this legal pleading of which we've just read in Joel chapter 3? Well, let's just read on a little more, because here, if you like, is the charge sheet. Here is the description of what it is that the God of heaven is going to argue, is going to fight the case about. "I will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage, Israel." The people of Yahweh. His people. The nation founded on the faithful man Abraham, who the Almighty drew out of that land, and later his nation that he drew out of Egypt for himself, that he bare them on eagle's wings and brought them to himself. That nation, God's nation. And what have the world done to it? You see the point there in verse 2. "They have scattered among the nations and parted my land." God's nation, who he put in that land, well, they've scattered them. And they've parted, that is, they have divided or apportioned the land. They've decided what shall happen. The very same word used in actual fact in Zechariah chapter 14 of the earthquake and the parting of the land. They've decided and divided up for themselves God's land, and you can see immediately the problem. And we read on that they have cast lots for my people and given a boy for an harlot and sold a girl for wine that they might drink. Gambling for the purchase of slaves, and perhaps just hinted at there, the licentiousness of the northern invader. And it's not unknown in times of war, is it, for that terrible sort of behaviour of armies to be seen. This is how, then, in the prophecy, they are going to treat God's people, this invading army, and the nations of the world at the time when Israel has returned to their land. Go on to verse 9. Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near, let them come up. So to prepare war, to honour as sacred, some have seen in this a suggestion of a holy war. Certainly, the idea that there is a definite effort being made here. And then again, verse 11, assemble yourselves and come all ye heathen, and gather yourselves together round about. There is that same idea of the nations being gathered together against God's people, and therefore ultimately against the Almighty himself. So this idea of gathering the nations is really at the heart of God's purpose. The issue, the case which he is pleading, is to do with his people and his land. And he's gathering the nations there that it might be perfectly evident to them, ultimately, that they are, in fact, fighting against him. And that idea is so prevalent and so repeated. Verse 12, let the heathen be wakened, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there will I sit to judge all the nations round about. So just consider, the heathen, the nations as a whole, are being wakened up and coming to that valley, because God is going to sit to judge. That idea again, to plead. Because as we saw in verse 2, I will gather all nations and bring them down there. This great challenge is all about that which the nations have to learn. We started off with the righteousness of God, that all the earth might come to understand what he views as right. The unclean spirits in Revelation 16 dictate what most people today view as right. And yet God has said, here is what is right. And I'm going to use the nation of Israel, flawed as they now are, but in that age to be brought into his covenant. He's to use that nation to demonstrate what he sees as right, which is why we read in Jeremiah 25, it is the controversy with the nations for his people and for his land. So we see the picture. He's going to gather all nations. He's going to plead with them. He's going to deal with his people Israel, who they've scattered among the nations. Because this, and there's just a clue here, thinking about that ancient nation and the opposition that there's been to Israel over centuries, it was the same. I think it's Idumea, is it, in chapter 36? I have spoken against the residue of the heathen, which have appointed my land into their possession. Now there it is. There is the issue on the line. There is God's land, and they have taken it for their own. I mean, it's supreme irony, isn't it? You think of all the countries of the earth, and God says, that's my land there. That's the one I've chosen. Here is Jerusalem. Let it come into your mind, he says. And all the nations say, well, we're going to have it for our own, thank you very much. And because the Almighty has said, of that nation I will bless them who bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. That is to be the basis then of his operation and of his judgment with the rest of the world, and how they have treated his people. This brings to mind a most interesting point. We sometimes are labouring perhaps under the impression that on the one hand we have what we think of as first principles, and on the other we have prophecy. and never the twain shall meet. You know, they're in sort of entirely in different categories. And yet it's not quite as simple as that, is it? Because what we understand to be the gospel, the good news of the kingdom of God, well, that is entirely dependent upon God's promises. And what prophecy does is show us how the first principles of the gospel are in fact about God's promises. And prophecy shows and gives us assurance about how God is going to fulfill them. Whether that be on the one hand the prophecy that God made to Abraham, or on the other about how he is going to vindicate the righteousness of his name and his character on the earth. The Almighty is going to carry it out. He will fulfill his will. So Joel 3 verse 13. Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come get you down, for the press is full, the fats overflow. There's detail here that I'd love to go into, but I just can't. But just for now, just let's understand and remember that we have these two stages in the process of judgment which the Almighty is pouring out. He had talks here about the sickle, just as we have it in Revelation 14, and also the vine harvest. The press is full. And there's that same picture, that same parallel in actual fact in Revelation chapter 14. But what we can say, and what we have seen already, is that the process of judgment then of the nations is being likened to harvest. We've seen that, haven't we, in chapter 3? He's going to use the sickle, which is to cut the wheat. And once you've cut the wheat, of course, you have to do something else with it, which, interestingly enough, is what verse 14 talks about. He says, multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. And your margin tells you that it means threshing. Precisely the same idea as we have it in actual fact in Amos chapter 1, where we have the idea of decision and threshing. And that is, so I am informed, in my ignorance of agricultural matters, that it is to beat or rub stalks of ripe corn or a similar crop to separate the grain from the husks and the straw. What a powerful picture that is. You have the wheat, but then you have to cut the wheat. But now you have a dividing process. You have to separate, as it says there, the husks and the straw from the grain. And when the Almighty comes to look at the nations then, there's an aspect of that in how he's dealing with them. So he's cutting the wheat. In Micah chapter 4, and I'm not going there now, he's going to gather the nations, we read, as sheaves at harvest. The language is very explicit. And of course, once you have cut the wheat, that is what you have to do, isn't it? And then, following up this idea we just thought about, in Micah chapter 4, verse 13, Israel is going to thresh the nations. God's nation, brought back to him, now brought back into his covenant in this picture. But you can see how that agricultural analogy is being carried forward until finally we read in Isaiah 41, the nations are winnowed. As with a brush then you take or some kind of fork, you lift all of that matter up into the air and you separate again the wheat from the chaff. Just as in actual fact you have that picture in Daniel chapter 2, where as the stone grows to fill the earth, the chaff is blown away. So this is God looking at the nations of the world and determining amongst them where his judgments lie based on how they have treated the nation of Israel. And that's why, based on that extended Old Testament figure, and I've only looked in brief detail at some of the places where it occurs, that's why it's so interesting, isn't it, when we come to Revelation 16 and we read of, in the Hebrew tongue, the concept of Armageddon. So, what are we really talking about? If we were reading one of the more modern versions, well, here's, if you like, the first modern version. It doesn't sound very modern now, does it, 1881? But, in fact, the Revised Version was the first version to be based upon one of those other manuscripts of the Bible that had been discovered in the years leading up to that. And people like Tischendorf, who went all around the world trying to find all kinds of other manuscripts. And he found the Codex Sinaiticus, which, let me just say here for the record, is very probably of questionable origin. And is not really helping us here, because it's telling us and giving us an interpretation, which, as we shall see, is a little unhelpful. It's called in Hebrew, apparently, Ha-Mageddon. And that has led commentators to the conclusion that Ha is a mountain, and Megiddo is in Manasseh in Galilee, and that therefore this place, north of Israel, is to be the place of judgment for the nations. And in fact, there is in Israel then Tel Megiddo in the north of Israel, which is all fine, apart from the fact that, of course, we've read of a valley, and this is a mountain. And there's another problem, which is, of course, that the whole essence and the centre that we've been reading about is how the nations are gathered against Jerusalem, which is some distance further south. Now, there's a lot more in that subject, and Brother Thomas had some most interesting things to say, which are broader perhaps than just that. But for now, let us at least acknowledge that Jerusalem is ultimately where there is this battle, or in that vicinity. And the Valley of Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 20 may well be related to that. We just notice that from the very beginning of Jerusalem's existence, the idea of threshing has been associated with it. Isn't that interesting? The very place where ultimately Abraham had to offer Isaac, and the very place where David bought that threshing floor, was the place that the Almighty had appointed to establish his temple. The place that God had chosen for humanity to understand the righteousness of his ways. And that's why then, so when we think about this idea of Armageddon, that you can see how we've established from the Old Testament the principles of the nations being gathered together. It would not come as a huge surprise, would it, that the Almighty is referring back to them. That when he gathers the nations to settle the issue of his people and his land, that he uses the same analogy. And that the Hebrew word, in fact, is not telling us of a mountain at Megiddo, but rather of a heap of sheaves. And as you see there, the use of that word, as Boaz slept on the heap of corn, a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. So it seems that the Almighty is using the same consistent picture through his word. He's established that he is going to settle the issue, that for generation after generation people have treated his people and his land for their own purpose. And he is going to say enough is enough. They are going to be before him as a heap of sheaves in a valley. But there is a most interesting connection. You see, we've established that it is a time when Israel have to be in their land. Joel 3 told us that. And the Hebrew tongue suggested it, I think. There is this point, that the nations have to be gathered. And we've seen that. But so also does Israel have to be gathered. We know these verses. Fear not, I am with thee. I will bring thy seed from the east and gather thee from the west. He that scattered Israel will gather him. Thou shalt come, in Ezekiel 38, the northern invader, into the land that is gathered out of many people. And God will surely assemble and gather the remnant of Israel. But here's the thing. The gathering of the nations back to God's land, the gathering of the nation of Israel back to God's land is the very thing that in the end will cause the nations of the world to be gathered against her. You see those two gatherings. How, in fact, the Almighty is using the one to gather the other. Well, let me explain why I say that. Just think about our world. There is Israel in the centre of it. What are the conditions that the Almighty has laid down as needing to be in place before this great battle can take place? Well, I'm not going to go all through Ezekiel 38, but here are some key points. It has to be the land brought back from the sword. Israel have to be the nation in the land, and most explicitly, they have to be on the mountains of Israel. And the desolate places have to be inhabited, and Israel has to dwell in the midst of the land. So very clear requirements for Ezekiel 38 to be fulfilled, and you appreciate I'm linking Ezekiel 38 then into this context. And not only so, but the position of the nation in the land has also to be, in addition to that, where they are, the condition that they are in is specified, because the northern invader comes down to take a spoil and to take a prey. There has to be a position of value and riches there in order for this northern invader to take it. Cattle and goods, silver and gold. And of course, not forgetting verse 11, they have to be dwelling safely. I shall say a little more about that, God willing, in our second talk. So 3, if you like, simple criteria. They have to be in the land, in the right place, dwelling on the mountains of Israel. They have to be prosperous, and they have to be peaceful. Well, you see, the point about the mountains is interesting. When we talk of mountains, of course, we're not talking of mountains in the way that we do in England, the English language, in terms of some great mountain. It's silly when the name of the highest mountain in the world escapes you, but whatever that mountain, Everest, thank you very much. Yes, it's not that kind of mountain, but it's these kinds of mountains. It's an interesting little study to follow up that the extent of the mountainous area of Israel is not only given to us on the map which shows us, but also within the scriptures. If you follow up those 2 locations, you find the 2 extremities of it. And the hill country of Judah, where Mary lived, where Elizabeth lived, and Mary went to see her, is part of that. So it's no great mystery as to where that is. That, of course, as you most probably know, is that area that is known as the West Bank today. And what most of the world has forgotten, of course, is that it was the West Bank and called that because it had been the West Bank of Jordan. And before that, it had just been part of Syria. And Israel, of course, took it by conquest in 1967. And that is the fact that has brought the nations of the world in their interest, hasn't it, against that nation, because they are now in the very place that Ezekiel 38 said they had to be, where the world says they cannot be. Isn't that the greatest irony? That the very place where the Almighty said they had to be, the world says they can't be. They have taken my land into their possession. They have divided my land. So, if we think of those 3 criteria, I think we can say simply that at least part of that is reflected in where they are now. And when we think about prosperity, and I'm only going to touch on this, we can see that certainly there is the beginnings, isn't there, of the potential at least of great prosperity. Whether it relates to this only is an interesting question. But the discovery of huge quantities of oil and gas in the last few years in Israel have indeed been really quite remarkable. It's only this year that one of the blockages to the development of those has been removed. We read in June that the owners of Leviathan, one of the biggest of those gas fields, has finally begun to get past these delays of years by political, legal and regulatory wrangling. The last obstacle to developing the field was swept away last month when the government approved the company's 2-stage plan to drill a total of 8 wells. So they're on the move, and there is vast potential, and in the other surrounding nations as well. So prosperity, there's certainly the beginnings of it, if nothing else. And the dwelling safely, well, we have more to see on that, I think. So how does the world think then of Israel in that location, in the very place where God said they had to be? Well, there is quite a well-defined movement which is known as BDS. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. And what it's all about is trying to delegitimize Israel in that locality, that they should not be there, and therefore anything they produce, the other nations of the world are being encouraged not to buy. So that the definition of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement is, well, a call against Israel until it complies with international law and Palestinian rights, which in short is that they shouldn't be where they are in fulfillment of Ezekiel 38. A truly global movement against Israeli apartheid is rapidly emerging in response to this call. Now, to anybody who lived through the 1980s and 90s, and I'm old enough to have done so, then, of course, the word apartheid has a particular ring, doesn't it? The position in South Africa in which blacks were discriminated against. And it's a very powerful and emotive term to apply to the situation in Israel. So much so that the leader of the BDS movement, a man called Omar Barghouti, has made this interesting comment. We are not there yet, but we are reaching our South Africa moment. In other words, that in his and their attempts to convince the world of the illegality of Israel's behaviour, and by the way, it doesn't mean that we need to approve of every single thing the Israeli government does. That's not our beef. We are not a political movement. We are simply drawing attention to the fact that God says they need to be there in that land to fulfil his prophecy. And by the way, we know also that the media is less than just always in their reporting, but we'll leave it there. Now, the South Africa moment. You see the power of this. If they can convince the nations of the world that this is the state of how things are in Israel, well, then there's a power to it. Lessons learned from the South Africa boycott. That's the understanding. By the way, it's got nothing to do with the fact that that same gentleman goes to Tel Aviv University. Right? Anybody knows anything about apartheid just puts that in context. He's been queried as to how that can be possible, and he has his own answer for that. But there we are. So, the point is, I said, that the fact that Israel was gathered to their land would be a factor in the nations being gathered against her. We're beginning perhaps to see how that could come about. The nations don't think she should be there. And so when we think of those things that the scriptures lead us to expect prior to the coming of Christ, well then we'd expect, wouldn't we, that the false prophet would be a mouth speaking great things. And he's had a few things to say about this very issue. When in 2014 he met with the Palestinian authorities, he said the time has come to forge a peace which rests on the acknowledgement by all of the right of two states to exist and to live in peace and security. It sounds all very fair, doesn't it? Two states to exist. That can only be just and right. Peace must resolutely be pursued, even if each side has to make certain sacrifices. And it sounds a very even-handed kind of response. Interestingly enough, on the same occasion, he also said that he expresses his appreciation for the efforts being made to draft an agreement with particular attention to religious freedom. Respect for this fundamental human right is in fact one of the essential conditions for peace, fraternity and harmony. So these three great principles of our modern world, which arguably are the three unclean spirits that shaped our modern world and came out the great events in France in 1789 in the French Revolution. And I know that's a whole story I hadn't explained, but for now let's just accept that that might be the case. Those are in the mouth of the false prophet, can you see? The liberty and the freedom, the fraternity or the brotherhood, and the equality is there, just as Revelation 16 requires it to be. But that's not all, because the holy places must be perpetually maintained. That there is an interest in the very place which God has said is his own for the nations of the world. And they must be maintained perpetually because we have an interest in them and all who want to visit them. Jerusalem will be the city of peace of the three regions. And look at this, everything is negotiated. All the territory, also the relations. And whether, I've missed out a bit, haven't I? Sorry. Whether it when it's negotiated, there might come forward this part, it will be capital of one state or of the other. It doesn't matter, as long as the holy places are protected. So the significance there, if we boil it all down, it seems to me is this. The right of two states to exist, each side has to make certain sacrifices, whatever they might be, and by the way, Israel's really had their own way for far too long. And the rights of the Palestinians must be respected, but God says, my heritage and my land. So you can see that the scene is being set, isn't it, for that conflict. For man to say one thing and for God to say another, as his declared will and purpose. What then of the northern invader and his allies? Because many times, isn't it, 5 times in Ezekiel 38, they are mentioned. You might just remember back a few years to the problem in Ukraine. And the problem was that Ukraine had to choose between the EU and the EU. And you might think at first that I've been careless on my slide, but I haven't, I promise you. The choice for Ukraine was, do we go to the west or the east? Do we go with Europe, the European Union, or do we go with the Eurasian Economic Union? Now, you may not have heard of the Eurasian Economic Union. You may have done if you follow these things, but it's certainly not reported regularly on the BBC, I don't think. But it is, in fact, the Eurasian Economic Union is the very thing that the Russians are developing and championing against the West. And over the last few years, in fact, that was the choice that Ukraine had, whether to continue to go further and further into Europe in the West, or to become part of this developing superstate, which is bound together by all these people who speak the same language and whose origins and cultural commonalities are rooted in their common Russian heritage. So much so that you could add to it the disputed Crimean Peninsula, of course. And that is what Putin is developing into a force of itself. It rivals in structure, by the way, all the sort of the ways that Europe has developed. It has its own commission and everything else. Only last week there was a meeting of a discussion club which took place in one of the old socialist republics, I think, that actually had a group of discussion of people from all over the world. They were there, American professors there, and Putin was there as their guest of honour, and answering questions, open questions from all these attendees for over 2 hours. It was quite extraordinary. You can see it on video. And the question was asked, what and who will be the main subjects in the chapter that will come after the one on the Putin era? What should be done so that the next chapter is not titled The Time of Trouble? Whether he was subconsciously quoting Daniel or otherwise, I don't know. But it's just interesting, isn't it? The idea that, well, after you, then, Mr. Putin, what happens? And just see what he says. Or what's your legacy, rather, is what I should say. It's the great thing for world leaders. And here's the legacy. The main thing is how we manage to bring Russian society and the Russian nation together. So if they're to be brought together, then they're not yet brought there. And his great goal and his vision is to do that. You can see how he's begun to do it. And the end of that paragraph, to unite everyone towards achieving the national goal. And you can see how he's done that, can't you? There was Russia through my younger years, through the 80s, when it was just a hulk of what it had been, and the army rusting away. And the world has woken up to the uncomfortable fact, hasn't it, over the last couple of years, of tremendous power and determination that there is there, such that we read only this week of the concerns of the security leaders of our nation, increasingly aggressive Russia, a growing threat to the UK. Of course, it was denied It was nonsense. It's everybody else who's a threat, but interesting. You may possibly have heard of the Moscow Victory Day parade in May 2015, when they celebrated the victory of Russia and her allies against the Nazis. And the extraordinary display of military power, hardware, people, soldiers, quite extraordinary. And there were also those there who, their friends from China. A great force. Many people with them. And there on display were all of those great armaments, to which there has now this week been added another one. Perhaps you've heard of Satan II, as they cutely named the rocket, or somebody did, that's going to go and have the ability to blow up vast numbers of humanity, should they so choose. And when they look in the Middle East, they see a nation that is beginning to show signs of prosperity in the very area which they themselves have been developing. The discovery of huge reserves looks set to put Israel well on the road towards energy, and it is likely to provide an attractive target for enemies of the Jewish state. Isn't that an extraordinary recognition by the world's media? And then, of course, there was the development and the growth and the movement of that ship towards Syria that just had to go through even our waters. And Israel, of course, had their own response to this growing threat in Syria, only just around them. Israel panicked by quantity of Russian presence, weaponry in region which dramatically hamper IDF operations. It's worth just getting the point of this. The Israeli Air Force and Navy were used to flying and sailing wherever and whenever they saw fit. But since Russia began to intervene in the Syrian civil war last year, things have changed. One particular worry was the impending arrival of that ship. I know the media laughed at it because it has to have a tug with it in case it breaks down, but look at this. The force has anti-submarine capabilities and boats with a wide range of missiles for aerial photography and intelligence gathering. Israeli defense officials admit that the Russians know about every movement Israel makes in its air and sea space, as there is no way to elude Russian radars, and thus Russia has been able to collect massive amounts of information. So the gathering in Syria has provided Russia with the very ability, apparently under the means of trying to wipe out enemy number one, ISIL. To how much effect is another open question, or to what effect and to what extent supporting Syria for their own reasons. But, well, they discovered that this strange drone that was sent into Israel was not sent as they'd initially thought by Hezbollah, but by Russia. And just notice that Russia claimed that the incident was the result of human error, rather like those strange aircraft incursions into our own airspace that were just by accident. But some people have suggested, well, perhaps they were just testing defence capabilities, well, maybe in Israel too. So what else? Just to briefly touch on this, the requirements of Ezekiel 38 were that Tarshish had an independent voice, wasn't it? That was the requirement. That at the end, and remember, Ezekiel 38 is the end picture. It doesn't tell us of all the circumstances that need to take place to get us there. But we have looked, haven't we, as a community, for Britain to be separated, to have the ability to have her own voice. And remarkably, it happened. At least the beginning of the process happened that was decreed a seismic result for British politics. Quite what will happen and how it will happen from this point on, of course, is a matter we will watch and wait to see. But that's the requirement of Ezekiel 38 at the end. And not only so, but also with her allies, Sheba, Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, who have to be allied to her. And there is just this interesting comment that was made in June of this year, the observation that one consequence of Brexit could be a further deepening of UK relations with Arab states, and increased bilateral trade, particularly with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. A convergence of interests where they share common objectives. So, trade and military links with the UK. And finally, to consider the EBS, or the European beast system. We've had, EMU, I remember, and the EUC and the EU. Well, the EBS, or the European beast system, is really what we're seeing, isn't it? And it's been developing, and now it's in a bit of crisis all of its own because of Brexit and other things. We mentioned Israel before, just interestingly, that, again, this week, the EU declared their support for that boycott movement, whilst they say, well, we can't delegitimise Israel itself. There's of course nothing wrong with continuing to support that movement, and that will have its own effect on those who see what they say. But I rather like this picture. This is actually in the EU Commission building on the morning after the Brexit vote, and there you see they have the BBC News on, and they're finding out, like everybody else, what's been going on, and there they are going to debate and to discuss their next move. And interestingly, they started to think about that, and their response was, well, obviously what we have to do is to deepen the EU integration in the space of Britain going off somewhere else. And with Britain, which had always adamantly opposed an integrated EU military policy, Berlin sees an opportunity for reviving its EU military capability. And after that, well, Italy put out its own proposal for an EU army that was even more closely linked together, because Britain has always opposed that integrated EU army, and now they feel able and necessary to go ahead with it. So whilst the end picture is what we're given, the trends are interesting, aren't they? Which way precisely it will go, we shall have to wait and see, but the picture is clear at the end. A group of nations who are being brought into the land to oppose the Almighty and His will and His people. Russia, developing it as a military, economic, political superpower, and perhaps with a need to gain some of that oil and gas in the end. Tarshish, an independent voice, her allies, and of course the EU there. Well, I have 2 points just to finish with. The first is just a reflection on the impact of Brexit for Russia. In parallel to European fissures, as Europe is in danger of breaking apart, Putin is consolidating strength. He's restored autocratic rule at home, crushing all serious dissent, and mobilising popular support through foreign war. He stopped NATO's expansion by invading Georgia in 2008, and slowed EU expansion by invading Ukraine in 2014. He's increased Russia's economic hegemony, his control, in other words, all kinds of different kinds. He's increased Russia's control in large parts of the former Soviet Union by building the EU that we mentioned, and as a result of his military intervention in Syria, Putin is expanding Russia's presence in the Middle East as Europe and the United States pull back. That's why, isn't it, Brother Thomas wrote a book called Russia Triumphant and Europe Chained. The picture is beginning to fit those expectations that our brethren have had for a long time. My final slide for this talk. The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand. The long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact, and salvation will be to those who not only looked for it, but have trimmed their lamps by believing the gospel of the kingdom unto the obedience of faith, and the perfection thereof in fruits meet for repentance. So if it is the case, brothers and sisters, that the Lord is at the door, what should that mean for us? How will the future be for us and for the world as the Lord approaches? This we shall consider in our second talk.